Randall at wakingthemonkey.blogspot.co.uk. Cosmic Claire on YouTube. Yeah, I know that's probably. Okay, well, I'm sorry I didn't get this done last night. I was really hoping to get this done last night, but I ended up having a real sound techie problem. It took me all evening to resolve. Windows had decided to change some setting. So anyway, I've had an extra bit of time to think about this, and I've seen an extra couple of items on it, but I'll just start off with the simple thing. Well, I think probably a lot of my viewers, subscribers, casual drop-ins will probably have seen the item by the BBC about typical Roman families, and the cartoon of a typical Roman family, which was apparently a Roman British family, which was apparently lots of white British women were apparently, it was typical to be married to African centurions, apparently. Anyways, obviously there's been quite a lot of huffing and puffing about this from various different sides, so I thought I would weigh in my own little few comments on this. Now, the real thing that got people exercised on this was the description by the BBC that this was a typical Roman British family. Now, so this caused all sorts of disagreement and stuff, and this wasn't originally said by Professor Mary Beard from some top university, but the BBC did bring her in, and she has managed to find evidence that apparently there are certain isolated incidences of non-European populations in Britain during the Roman period. So I don't wish to deny this evidence. You know, if you've got factual material archaeological evidence, then of course that's what it is. But what does it mean? What does it mean? This seems to have been particularly jumped onto by the cultural Marxists, who are absolutely desperate to prove how multicultural Britain was in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th and into the 5th centuries when the Romans left. But is this? But what exactly are they saying? What exactly are they saying? So they're not saying that there were noticeable numbers or even any communities of non-British before the Romans came. Julius Caesar famously came, he saw and he left, claiming to have conquered without having done much. But then about 80 years later, was it his grandnephew or something, Claudius, around about 44 AD, I think it was, brought the Roman invasion to Britain and successfully conquered Britain now. So the Romans were here until about 410 when the legions left. So we had about 400 years or just a bit less of Roman occupation. And so what these scholars such as Professor Mary Beard are saying is that during that 400 years, some number of people from the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire, remember, stretched from, Hadrian's Wall to Syria and possibly beyond, halfway up the Nile in Egypt, and the North African coast, Morocco, Libya, which was then Carthage. So the Rome was a kind of proto-EU. Obviously, it's extended a bit further. Now, the EU obviously has become infamous for its multicultural diversity, racial migrations, immigration, and so on and so forth. And it was similar in the Roman time, but it wasn't quite so kind of pushed and uncontrolled. Obviously, they didn't have quite so many people to manage. But what we have to understand is that these people who came here and whom Mary Beard and others are so keen to remind us of our multicultural communities here in Britain during the Roman period, they really omit to mention the most obvious thing, which is, I've already mentioned, that the Romans invaded Britain, right? It was a military invasion. Rome was the superpower of the Western world in the 1st century, and obviously there were, rebellions, Boudica, and they were crushed ruthlessly. What Rome said happened, right? I think we've got to accept this. So Rome was a multicultural culture, or a multicultural empire. This was one of the things that brought it down eventually, but that's what its nature was, because it had Gauls, Celts, Germans, and that was only in the north, and obviously, as I've said, up into the Middle East. So what this facilitated was opportunistic migration, or migration. Some of the people who came with the legions will have been from not from Northern Europe. So this was the result of, I do want to kind of make this similarity with the EU, because the EU is forcing population mixing on Europe at the moment, and this is what the Romans did, basically. So one of the things that's happened in my own discussion of this is I've come across people on Twitter, because there's been a kind of threads on this on Twitter, and one of the things I keep getting is people saying, well, what's wrong with Britain having been multicultural? Why are you so afraid of our history? Why are you afraid of multiculturalism? Well, I'm not afraid of our history, but we have to accept this is a history of conquest, oppression and subjugation by the Romans. So why should we say, why should we, as the descendants of the Britons, look back on the Roman era as a wonderful time of multiculturalism? There were economic benefits, as there often are with these kind of things, but there would also have been cultural disadvantages. And I know that apparently there has been a graveyard in Leicester, I believe, found with some skeletons that have been identified as African, and everybody in the left is saying, look how multicultural it was, right? So you found a few skeletons and apparently a few fragments of DNA, but from African sources, and apparently this is supposed to replace the massive indigenous population of continuous, population of 3 to 5 million, thought to be. I mean, Mary Beard says, we don't know how many people there were in Roman Britain. Well, you can get a fairly good guess. In medieval England, before the Black Death, there was somewhere in the region of 4 million people, it's thought, 3 to 4 million perhaps. And there's no reason why it should have been a great deal less in Roman times. In fact, it could well have been more, because the trade and it was a great deal more stable in some ways under the Romans, and certainly the population movements that took place under the Romans indicate long settled period. Of course, the Roman Empire lasted for at least 400 years, depending on where you claim it started and when exactly it finished, and where the borders were at what particular time. But I think it is just such a complete kind of cultural Marxist trope, if you will forgive my cliche, to suggest that Britain has always been multicultural because the Roman invasion brought people from other parts of the Roman Empire. That's basically what they're saying. The Roman invasion in the middle of the 1st century brought people from different parts of the empire. And I'm just looking at Mary Beard's, she's written an article for the Times Literary Supplement. Now, she mentions a Professor Nassim Taleb, who cites genetic evidence and stuff, but she doesn't actually deal with his evidence, so I'm not convinced there. She just says that he was a bit rude to her, and she wishes he was a bit nicer or something. But then she goes on to say about the genetic evidence, she says that here we are, Septimus Severus, right, who was a Roman Empire, who was supposedly African. Now, that they don't even know the colour of his skin. Well, if he was African in the sense that we think of Africans today, he would be black, wouldn't he? Obviously, there are North Africans who are not black, Arabic, Maghrebi kind of people. But they are mostly descended from the Arabic conquerors of the 7th and 8th centuries, who wiped out the European population of North Africa. So if Septimius Severus, the first Roman emperor for Africa, Libya, was African, well, I mean, that's kind of meaningless, really, because, Carthage was African, Hannibal was African, but these people were all of European descent. The populations of North Africa before the Arabic conquest of the 7th century were principally Europeans, people with fair hair, blue eyes, and so on and so forth. And if you haven't quite got your head round this, wonder where the Berbers and the Circassians, now the Circassians are from Turkey, I think, but it's a similar kind of situation. Berbers often have ginger hair, red hair and blue eyes and fair skin. They're quite clearly not an Arabic or an African race. They're a European race, and they just one of the groups that survived the Arabic conquest of the formerly Roman lands in North Africa, which were principally European peoples. And the same with the Circassians, as the famous example of when T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, was working undercover, and an Arab or a Turk questioned his identity because he had blue eyes and fair hair, and he said Circassian. And of course his language, his speaking of Middle Eastern tongues was so good that, they couldn't pick him up on that. So, oh, okay, Circassian, yeah, fine. Circassians have blonde hair and blue eyes, right? So obviously Circassians are not Arabic or Turks. They also are the remnants of white peoples. So going back to Septimius Severus, the fact that he came from Libya proves absolutely nothing. And we don't seem to have any, images of him that, are detailed enough to... and there's another one here who they also mention, Quintus Lollius Urbicus, who is often, they say, claimed to be a Berber. Well, I've just mentioned the Berbers. So what's clearly going on here is that the cultural left are using selective information to claim that Britain has always been multicultural. It's just complete trash. Before the Romans came here, there can only have been a very small number of adventurers or mercenaries who might have come from so far away as south of the Mediterranean. And even if they did, they will have come as pirates and adventurers. There were settled communities under the Romans, but these came with the invaders, right? And there don't seem to have been any of these communities, and we're not even sure that they were communities. We just have a few isolated skeletons that have African characteristics. But these so-called communities, they may have just come and then just kind of like either died out or blended in, But these communities, they're not no recognisable non-European communities survived the Dark Ages. So they either died out or they blended in and were lost. And then people like Mary Beard and some other people claim, oh, well, we found a few fragments of African DNA in isolated populations. Well, so what? So what? That a few people who came with the Romans lived here for a few hundred years with the Romans as, settlers with the invading army. And then when the invading occupation left in 410, then, well, probably a lot of these people will have left because they will have been associated with the Romans. And the few small groups that will have come here and actually settled will have either died out or blended out and left their fragmentary traces of odd bits of genetic material left here. And I mean, this is, as far as I'm aware, this is extremely controversial matter anyway, because I've seen numerous reports on genetic studies of how the English are still principally, the majority of our DNA actually goes back to the original settlers of about 10,000 years ago, and there have been overlays of other groups who have come here, usually as invaders. The Romans were invaders, the Saxons were invaders, the Danes were invaders, and some of them were a bit worse than others. And then, of course, there was the Normans, who were not very nice. And I saw a comment in one of these articles, I think it was the Mary Beard one that I was looking at here, which said, well, there's not a lot of Norman DNA. Well, to my understanding, the initial invasion of England by Duke William and his followers was about 10,000 Norman knights, right? So there's 10,000 Norman knights. Obviously, a few more will have come on. But remember, Normandy was only a province, and a province which had only been settled for about 150 years by the Normans, who were Norsemen. That's where they got the name from. So they had actually come down from like Norway and Denmark, so they were kind of closely related to us anyway. So people say, oh, well, there's not very much Norman, and that's only 950 years ago. But there were small numbers, and just as with the Anglo-Saxons, there does appear to be evidence that while Anglo-Saxons became extremely dominant in terms of culture, their numbers were small, and the actual genetic component that they contributed to the English, despite the fact that we're called after the Angles, is actually less than the native indigenous population that came here in the Ice Age. So we have these continual kind of overlays or introductions of invading DNA, which have made small changes to it. We can't deny that. But my view is that the cultural left are vastly overblowing the importance of the existence of multicultural, in other words, foreign communities that lived in this country, England, or Britain as it was then, although, of course, Scotland was a separate country, so basically Roman Britain was England and Wales. But it's being exploited. So basically they're misrepresenting this. They're saying, oh, well, Britain has always been multicultural, so, why shouldn't we invite people from all sorts of different cultures and races and nations and religions and things to this country now, because we've always been multicultural. And I'd make a comparison here with the Spanish Reconquista. It's not quite the same, but I do think there's a legitimate analogy here, because under the Romans, Spain was largely, it was an occupied country under Rome, and then the Visigoths, the Western Goths, settled there when Rome, was falling in the 5th and 6th centuries, and they kind of adapted the Roman civilization in Spain, and they were the people who were to become the Spanish, as we know them today. Although there were different strands within that, and then in the end of the 7th century, once the Arab Islamic Caliphate had conquered North Africa and ethnically cleansed it pretty much of its European populations, then it came and invaded Spain, and there's many very interesting time-lapse maps of the occupation of Spain by the Moors, and how the Visigoth kingdoms became eventually able to reclaim the land from the Moors, and it took many, many centuries. I think it was about 8.5 centuries, from the early 8th century to the end of the 15th century, and there were all the separate kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, Leon, Navarre. Portugal became a separate kingdom, and eventually they reclaimed the land for Europeans, and the Moors were expelled. A few were allowed to stay, I suppose, but there was the Inquisition to make sure they weren't covert Muslims and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, I understand that Spain is now kind of apologising for this. I mean, it's just utterly bizarre. I don't ever see anything about Islam apologising for the ethnic cleansing of North Africa of European peoples. Must have been, I think there's been something like 300 million people killed by the Islamic caliphates, all the way from Gibraltar to Indonesia. So it's quite clear that the cultural Marxists are basically exploiting fragments of evidence to persuade us that we've always been multicultural, that we should be multicultural, and that it's good for us. But sorry, I've got a little moth here. This is something that's been designed to undermine us, because there have been, once these non-British, non-Northern European peoples left or were blended out, then there were no multicultural communities. I don't think they're even claiming this, but there were none. There were no multicultural communities, no multiracial communities, until the Northern Europeans. I mean, we really can't think of Northern Europeans such as the Normans, the Danes, the Angles, the Saxons as being the same as people from, the other side of the Mediterranean, which they're trying to, argue us into believing. And when even the people who did come from the other side of the Mediterranean were actually more similar to us, probably, than they are trying to persuade us. So I'm not, this is just, I think this is just a massive kind of psyop against us and I'm going to do another video, because there's not time on this one. I'm going to do another video on the cultural appropriation of white literature and contemporary culture, Spider-Man. But I think I'm kind of winding up towards the end of this. But one last thing just come to my mind is that one of the things that there's a, what's his name now? There's a chap by the name of Chris Kimberley. Go and pay Chris Kimberley a visit on Twitter, because he says things like, "Why are you afraid of multiculturalism?" Which is a classic cultural Marxist kind of thing, which is like, well, why are you trying to foist it on me? Why are you trying to foist it on me? First of all, sorry, I've got this bloody moth flapping around here. Yes, right, that moth keeps distracting me. It's the tyranny of the minority. Yeah, so there were some non-Brits here. There were some non-Europeans even. There were some even Arabic or African people who were here. Well, okay, yeah, I don't have a problem with that being a historical fact. If it's a historical fact, it's a historical fact. But for a start, we have to remember, right, one, they came with the invading army of occupation, right? Okay, so they don't, from my point of view, have a legitimate right here, right? And the second one is that they are distinctly, obviously a minority, because they've only left a very fragmentary genetic trace in the vast majority ancestral population of these islands. At one point, one of these people said something like, no, I can't find it here. The thread was too long. But one of them said something to the effect of, when I said, well, you're looking at the populations in the large towns and cities, such as Londinium, Colchester, whatever, where obviously these immigrant populations would exist because they came with the Roman army of occupation. The Roman army obviously was based in and around the large towns, the forts, and so on and so forth. So I said, well, maybe you should look at the actual peasant population and see how much got embedded in them, not the urban populations, because it's kind of like America, where the urban populations of New York and California are the ultra-liberals, when the rest are all super conservatives. So it's the same kind of thing here. And this gentleman, I shan't descend to his level, this gentleman, Chris Kimberley, said, peasants, so now we know. So he's kind of suggesting that, they're just peasants. Again, this is classic kind of cultural left. They claim to be all kind of socialist and care for the working and the people and the, downtrodden, poor people who work hard and everything. Because when it actually comes to like the indigenous British peasants, they're just peasants. We don't like them. We much prefer the minority. And this is what they do. This is like, I've said this on my other videos about trans and LGBT, and it's a minority. I don't feel that just because I'm in a minority that I should be able to dictate to the population. And this is the same thing here. They're claiming that there was some small minority, of 3, 4, 5 million people. There were maybe, a few tens of thousands, because the occupation army was about 125,000. And obviously they weren't all, black Numidians. I mean, as somebody posted on one of the threads I was on, they said, I doubt that even if there were any Numidians, that they settled here, So this is distortion of the facts, and they always want to make sure that the minorities, like, there was one black person in Roman Britain, so accept diversity, you know. So, you know, you can quibble about the details and everything, but this is the basic kind of overview, that it was a small introduced minority, which largely left with the Romans, and the remnant of them died out. And because there's a few genetic traces, doesn't mean that we should now wish to resurrect this whole thing, just like there's a few genetic traces of the Moors in the, you know, Spanish European population. It doesn't mean that they should, oh, well, you know, we've got to, you know, invite all these people in to, you know, destabilise us all over again. You know, let's go back to the, you know, 12th century when, you know, we were at constant war with the invading armies of the Moors. No, these people who seem to, they just want to find reasons to destroy the existing culture, the existing civilization, the existing nation, the existing race and ethnicities of these cultures and countries that we, you know, have existed. And if you look at what's happening in France and Germany and Sweden, and very much in this country, in England, Britain as well, you can see that these people are making quite kind of, they are having an impact. They are destroying our culture and they're destroying our people. So we have to just completely just resist this. And, you know, a few foreigners came to this country, you know, 1,500 years ago, and then they left or they died out, and, you know, other related peoples like the Saxons and the Danes, you know, came here, but they blended in, and they had a much more successful time because they were closely related, and their culture that they were bringing with them was not that different, unlike the remnant of Africans. They didn't leave anything here that anybody can recognise because they came from a completely different culture which was not adaptable to Northern Europe in the same way as all the people who are coming from the Middle East now are not adaptable to the Northern European culture. So it's all a sham. Yeah, they keep saying this, don't they? What is it about diversity that so terrifies you? Well, why are you trying to force this on us? You know, they just say this. Why are you forcing? So I say, why are you forcing this on us? Why would you want? You know, if you would you want some foreigners coming living in your house if you didn't know them? I mean, it's just pathetic. These people, they think that by insulting you or saying something unpleasant to you, that they can prove that you are, you know, a racist. Merely because you point out that they are trying to inflict their cultural deconstruction on you, and they believe that just because a dominant group has occupied a land for 10,000 years, that, you know, well, that's just arbitrary, you know, you know, oh, they had a few people from another culture came here once, so you've got to let the whole world in. It's just complete nonsense, and I simply don't accept it. And unfortunately, Dr. Mary Beard, she doesn't really understand the political implications of what she's got into, unfortunately. So I don't really, you know, want to give her a hard time. It's the trolls like this Chris Kimberley, and there's another one called Jim Hawkins. They're just, they don't respect. They would respect if they said, oh yeah, well, you know, we've got to respect Nigerians, you know, in their country, but why should we respect, you know, why should we respect white people in this country who've been the dominant race and the dominant culture here since, you know, at the end of the Ice Age. But you know, my father worked in Nigeria for 20 years. So, you know, I don't think he would like to be considered an indigenous Nigerian. But these people, they say things like, oh yeah, one of the things I forgot to mention was that one of them said, well, the moment they got here and they settled, they became indigenous. No, I looked up the word indigenous. The word indigenous means naturally occurring, right? So the naturally occurring people are the people who are descended from the people who already have been here and settled here and have ancestors here. And then when the Saxons and the Danes came along, they blended in because they could, because the Danes and the Angles and the Celts were all such similar people that they were able to intermarry and nobody could tell the difference in a way that you cannot with an African. So, you know, they claim that African populations coming to this country are the same as a Danish invasion of a few thousand warriors, or I mean, these people, they are unable to distinguish categories. They just see one great big blue, you know, and oh, you've got to have diverse. Well, obviously it's contradictory, isn't it? It claims to be diverse, but then, oh well, you know, if you say, well, I'm of a different group, no, you're all the same, right? So this is all just cultural Marxist mind games to make you feel that you should give up your land, your heritage, to multiculturalism and to foreigners. And you know, this is obviously, there are more and more people are resisting this, and I'm very, very pleased to see there's been quite a big strong kickback against this nonsense. So please drop into Twitter and join in on this thread if you like, at Waking the Monkey, and there's a few other people on this thread. Nice chap by the name of Al Holmes, who's been making supportive stuff, great chap. So I'll wind it up there. Plenty more I can say, I'll have to say in other videos. So thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, share, whatever. I want to get these videos out to more people, so please do subscribe if you haven't before, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Of non-European populations in Britain during the Roman period. So I don't wish to deny this evidence. You know, if you've got factual material archaeological evidence, then of course that's what it is. But what does it mean? What does it mean? This seems to have been particularly jumped onto by the cultural Marxists, who are absolutely desperate to prove how multicultural Britain was in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th and into the 5th centuries when the Romans left. But is this? But what exactly are they saying? What exactly are they saying? So they're not saying that there were noticeable numbers or even any communities of non-British before the Romans came. Julius Caesar famously came, he saw and he left, claiming to have conquered without having done much. But then about 80 years later, was it his grandnephew or something, Claudius, around about 44. Hello, Claire Ray Randall at Waking the Monkey, wakingthemonkey.blogspot.co.uk. Cosmic Claire on YouTube. Yeah, no, that's probably. Okay, well, I'm sorry I didn't get this done last night. I was really hoping to get this done last night, but I ended up having a real sound techie problem. It took me all evening to resolve. Windows had decided to change some setting. So anyway, I've had an extra bit of time to think about this, and I've seen an extra couple of items on it, but I'll just start off with the simple thing. Well, I think probably a lot of my viewers, subscribers, casual drop. The real thing that got people exercised on this was the description by the BBC that this was a typical Roman British family. Now, so this caused all sorts of disagreement and stuff, and this wasn't originally said by Professor Mary Beard from some top university, but the BBC did bring her in, and she has managed to find evidence that apparently there are certain isolated incidents. Will probably have seen the item by the BBC about typical Roman families, and the cartoon of a typical Roman family, which was apparently a Roman British family, which was apparently lots of white British women were apparently, it was typical to be married to African centurions, apparently. Anyways, obviously there's been quite a lot of huffing and puffing about this from various different sides, so I thought I would weigh in my own little few comments on this. Now,